He was the most feared man in New York City, Mafia boss, untouchable, surrounded by politicians, judges, and killers who called him family. And on the night of his birthday, with 500 powerful people watching, he took the one gift offered with genuine love and smashed it onto the marble floor. He laughed. His guests laughed. The woman who gave it said nothing. She simply picked up the broken pieces with her bare hands and walked away. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she was about to become the most powerful person in that room. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The invitation had come 6 weeks earlier, slipped under Claire Whitmore's apartment door in a cream-colored envelope with the Moretti family crest embossed in gold on the back flap. She'd stared at it for a long time before opening it. Not because she was surprised, Damien always sent his invitations by hand, but because something in her chest had tightened the moment she saw her name written in his assistant's careful script, and she wasn't entirely sure whether that tightening was anticipation or dread. She'd chosen to call it anticipation. She was wrong. The ballroom of the Carlisle Grand occupied the entire top floor of a midtown skyscraper, and on a clear December night, the floor-to-ceiling windows turned Manhattan into something that looked almost mythological. Thousands of lights burning against black sky, the Hudson a dark ribbon far below, the whole city arranged like an audience waiting for something to happen. Claire arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes after the doors had opened. She'd spent 2 weeks deciding what to wear and had ultimately returned to a dress she already owned. Gray silk, modest cut, nothing about it designed to impress. Her hair was pinned simply at the back of her neck. She wore no jewelry except a thin silver bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother. The coat check attendant accepted her coat without looking at her face. The security detail at the inner doors gave her invitation a 3-second inspection, then waved her through with the same expression they gave the waitstaff. She told herself that didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things that night. Inside, the room was already dense with the particular energy of people who were accustomed to being watched. Senators moved in small clusters near the bar, their laughter calibrated precisely loud enough to signal ease without suggesting excess. 2 federal judges stood beside the window in what appeared to be casual conversation, though neither of their eyes moved casually. Corporate executives Claire recognized from business magazines occupied the space nearest the entrance to the private dining corridor, their suits carrying the kind of effortless cost that was never meant to look effortful. And threaded through all of it, through the champagne flutes and the string quartet and the low murmur of 100 simultaneous negotiations, were men who had no titles, no business cards, no presence on any public record, but whose positions in this room were understood by everyone present with the precise clarity of a written contract. Damien Moretti's people. Damien himself stood at the center of the room, the way certain men stand at the center of any room they enter. Not loudly, not with performance, but with a settled certainty that the room had been organized around him, that the geometry of the space had adjusted itself to accommodate his presence. He was 35 years old and carried it without apology. Dark hair, dark suit, a face that had been handsome long enough to have stopped caring about it. He was laughing at something a silver-haired man in a senator's pin was saying, one hand loose around a glass of scotch he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, and when his eyes moved across the room, which they did constantly, the way a man's eyes move when he has spent his entire adult life reading every room he enters for threats, they passed over Claire without pausing. Not because he hadn't seen her, because this was the way things worked between them and had always worked, and she had told herself she understood it. She found a quiet position near the east wall, beside a floral arrangement that was taller than she was, and she held the gift she'd brought against her side and watched him work the room. Watched him shake the hand of a man whose construction company had made the front page of the Times 3 times in the past year for city contracts that nobody could fully explain. Watched him embrace, briefly, a woman who ran one of the largest private equity operations in the Northeast, their greeting carrying the warmth of people who had done each other significant favors. Watched a capo. She had learned enough in 2 years to recognize them by the way they stood at the edge of his orbit, present but never presuming. Approach Damien's ear and say something that made Damien's jaw set for exactly 2 seconds before the smile returned. 2 seconds. She'd learned to read him in increments that small. The gift she'd brought was wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen twine. It had taken her 4 months to find it, and another 6 weeks to restore it. An antique pocket watch, Swiss movement, 1923, the kind of piece that serious collectors would have kept behind glass. The original owner's initials, letters that happened to match Damien's own, were engraved on the inside of the case lid in a script so fine it required good light to read properly. The mechanism had been frozen when she found it at an estate sale in Connecticut. She'd taken it apart herself, cleaned every component individually, replaced 2 hairsprings and a worn crown gear, and reassembled it over the course of 9 evenings at her kitchen table with a jeweler's loupe and a patience she hadn't known she possessed until she met him. She was not a jeweler. She was a painting restorer. But the skills, she had discovered, were adjacent in ways that mattered, the willingness to handle broken things with enough care that they became whole again. She had not told him she was bringing it. She wanted to see his face when he opened it. The real face, not the one he showed this room. She waited an hour and a half. During that time, 3 different people she didn't know looked through her rather than at her. A server with a tray of canapes almost walked into her because he hadn't registered her presence against the wall. A woman in a red gown who turned out to be the wife of a city council member asked Claire if she could point her toward the restrooms, apparently having concluded that Claire was part of the venue staff. "I'm a guest," Claire said. The woman's expression managed to convey both apology and doubt simultaneously. Claire pointed her toward the restrooms anyway. The gift presentation was informal. Damien's events always were, in the sense that the structure was invisible rather than absent. Someone dimmed the music slightly. The crowd naturally oriented itself toward the long table near the windows where gifts had been accumulating throughout the evening. Boxes from Tiffany and Cartier, a bottle of wine in a wooden case that Claire recognized as something that cost more than her monthly rent, an envelope that almost certainly contained either a significant check or documentation for something that would never appear in any public record. Claire moved through the crowd toward him. It took her a while. The crowd was thick, and it did not part for her the way it parted for people it recognized. Damien was opening gifts with the relaxed attention of a man who had received many gifts and was practiced at being gracious about all of them. His capos stood nearby. Victoria Kensington stood closer than nearby, a position she occupied with the natural ease of a woman who had decided that proximity to power was its own form of ownership. Victoria was everything the room could see and measure. Manhattan family, old money, the kind of beauty that photographed well at political fundraisers, a vocabulary engineered from birth to signal both education and entitlement. She'd had her eye on Damien for 2 years, and had never bothered to conceal it, in part because concealment would have required acknowledging Claire as a rival worth the effort. Claire reached the edge of the inner circle. One of the capos, a heavy-set man named Sal, whose eyes were always doing 3 things at once, registered her arrival and stepped slightly to the side without quite making it an invitation. Damien turned and saw her. Something moved across his face. She had learned to read that too, the way certain things moved across his face when no one else was technically watching, though someone was always technically watching. The thing that moved across his face said, "You're here." And underneath it, if you knew where to look, it said something warmer than that. Then it said, "Not now. This isn't the moment." She held out the gift. "Happy birthday, Damien." His expression settled into the public version of itself. Warm, easy, contained. "Claire." He accepted the package, and she watched him clock the brown paper, the kitchen twine, the modest size of it against the other offerings on the table. She watched him make that calculation in less than a second, the way he made every calculation. He pulled the twine loose and unfolded the paper carefully, which was more care than he needed to take, and she felt something unlock in her chest at that, until she realized the care was public performance, not private attention. Then she felt the thing relock. The watch sat in his palm. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his thumb move over the case, the engraved initials, the weight of it. "Open the lid," she said quietly. He did. He read the initials on the inside, looked up at her briefly with something she couldn't fully classify. "Swiss movement, 1923, she said. "I restored it. The mechanism hadn't run in decades. It runs now." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Victoria Kensington's voice cut through it with the precision of something that had been sharpened. Is it wrapped in grocery paper? A light laugh directed at no one and everyone simultaneously. Damien, sweetheart, did someone wrap your birthday gift in grocery paper? The laugh spread. Not riotously, not cruelly, in the obvious sense. It spread the way laughter spreads in rooms full of people who are always watching for the correct social cue. A ripple of amusement moving outward from Victoria's voice like something dropped into still water. Damien's face did the thing it did when a calculation resolved. A very fast thing. A thing that took less than a second and rearranged everything. A pocket watch. He turned it in his hand and his voice had shifted into something Claire didn't recognize immediately. Lighter than usual, directed outward rather than inward, performing for the room. Did you find this at a garage sale? Another ripple of laughter. Someone near the bar actually turned around. She felt the floor lose an inch beneath her feet. An estate sale, she said. Her voice was level. She couldn't entirely feel her hands. I restored the mechanism myself. It took 6... Claire. He set the watch on the table beside the other gifts, and his voice had the gentled quality of someone being patient with a child who didn't understand the room they were in. You brought a broken antique to a birthday celebration. He looked at the crowd with an expression she would spend months trying to forget. A small, rueful smile, directed at 500 people, that said, "You see what I deal with." I think what she means is she found something at a flea market. The laughter was easier now, more comfortable with itself. She opened her mouth. She didn't know what was going to come out of it. What came out was nothing. Damien picked the watch back up, turned it over once more. The movement was casual, dismissive, final. And then it was neither casual nor dismissive, but simply final, because he set it at the edge of the table, and his elbow caught it, or appeared to catch it, and the watch dropped onto the marble floor with a sound that cut through the room like a struck bell. The case cracked open. A hairspring she had spent 2 evenings aligning freed itself and caught the light for one bright instant before going still. Absolute silence. Then Damien's attention moved to the next gift on the table, and his voice resumed its natural register, and the room understood that the moment was over. Claire stood for 3 seconds, in which the silence in her own skull was so complete she could hear her own pulse. Then she bent down, picked up the watch case, picked up the pieces that had scattered, cupped them in both hands, straightened. She did not look at Damien. She did not look at Victoria. She looked at the floor in front of her feet, one step at a time, all the way to the exit, and she did not stop, and she did not shed a single tear, and she did not make a sound, and the crowd parted for her now. Easily, automatically, the way crowds always part for people who have nothing left to lose. The doors to the ballroom were heavy. She pushed through them with her shoulder because both her hands were full of broken things. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the commotion begin behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard voices rising, heard the particular shift in ambient sound that signals something significant breaking through the surface of an event. She kept walking. Her heels struck the marble floor, and each strike felt like a period at the end of a sentence. She reached the elevator bank and pressed the call button and stared at the seam between the elevator doors and breathed. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. As the doors began to close, she heard, distantly from the direction of the ballroom, a voice she didn't recognize saying a name she did. Her name. And beneath it, fragmentary, cut off by the closing doors, something about a legal team, something about an estate, something about Whitmore. The elevator descended. In her cupped hands, the broken pieces of the watch lay against each other in the dark, and the city dropped away outside the glass, and Claire Whitmore stared at her own reflection in the elevator door and tried to remember the last time she had felt her own face. She couldn't. The lobby arrived. The doors opened. Behind her, 30 floors above, in a ballroom full of the most powerful people in New York City, a name was being spoken that was about to change everything. And the woman who owned it was walking through a revolving door into the December cold without looking back, her hands full of broken glass and bent metal, her face as still as the surface of water that has been struck so many times it has forgotten how to ripple. She didn't know what was happening upstairs. She didn't know that a convoy of black SUVs was pulling to the curb outside, had in fact already pulled to the curb, their engines still running, their occupants waiting for the right moment. She didn't know that William Hawthorne, senior partner of the most discreet law firm in the country, was already stepping out of the lead vehicle with a leather portfolio under his arm and a look on his face that people in his profession reserved for moments of permanent consequence. She didn't know that 30 floors above her, in a room where she had just been reduced to a punchline, 500 people were about to hear her name spoken in a register that none of them, not the senators, not the judges, not the capos, not Damian Moretti himself, had ever heard it spoken in before. She walked toward the corner, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. She still had the broken pieces in her hands. She wasn't ready to put them down yet. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, and Claire walked through them without breaking stride, and the cold hit her the moment the revolving door released her onto the sidewalk, a December cold that had teeth that found the gap between her collar and her jaw and pressed in without apology. She stopped at the edge of the curb. 3 black SUVs sat idling in a line along the hotel's drop-off lane, their engines running, exhaust rising in pale columns against the dark. The vehicles were the kind of black that was a decision rather than a color, matte, intentional, the automotive equivalent of a closed door. The lead vehicle's rear window was down exactly 2 inches. She could see nothing through it. She was still holding the pieces of the watch. A man stepped out of the lead SUV. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal overcoat that had been cut by someone who charged accordingly. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the particular deliberateness of a person who had never once in his professional life been in a hurry because he had always understood that everyone else would wait. He looked at her and said, "Miss Whitmore?" Not a question. "I'm William Hawthorne." He paused, as though the name was expected to do work, then continued when her face registered nothing beyond exhaustion. "I've been your grandfather's attorney for 31 years. I'm sorry for the timing of this. We've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Claire looked at him. "My phone is on," she said. "Your grandfather's estate held a secondary contact protocol." He glanced briefly at her hands, at the broken pieces cupped there, and whatever conclusion he drew from that, he kept it behind his eyes. "We need to go upstairs, Miss Whitmore. The full announcement was supposed to occur privately, with you present, but we've run out of time on the estate's transition window. If we don't establish documented presence of the primary heir at the formal disclosure event tonight, the secondary disbursement clause activates automatically, and the litigation that follows will take a decade to untangle." He paused. "That's a simplified version. The full version is considerably worse." The cold pressed in. Claire looked down at the broken watch pieces in her hands. The hairspring had caught a thread of streetlight, glinting faintly. She'd spent 2 evenings on that hairspring. She'd held it with tweezers under a loop and breathed shallowly so as not to disturb it. She closed her hands around the pieces. "How long has my grandfather been gone?" she asked. 11 days, Hawthorne said quietly. She absorbed that. 11 days she hadn't known. 11 days the world had gone on organizing itself around a fact she was unaware of. "He asked that you be told in person," Hawthorne said. "He was very specific about it. He didn't want a phone call. He thought you deserved—" He paused, choosing. "He thought the information should be delivered with appropriate gravity. He thought it should be delivered before I walked into a room of 500 people who already knew," she said. Hawthorne had the decency to look pained. "We didn't anticipate—" "Take me upstairs," she said. She slipped the broken watch pieces into the small clutch she was carrying, closed it, and looked at him steadily. "Let's go." What happened in the ballroom in the 4 minutes that followed was something that 31 of the people present would describe in some form for the rest of their lives, with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment, but with a consistency on the essential details that gave the accounts a documentary quality unusual for events of that nature. Hawthorne's team entered first, 3 attorneys and 2 executives from Meridian Capital Partners, one of the 3 largest private investment firms in the United States. They moved in a formation that was not aggressive but was unmistakably purposeful, and the room absorbed their entry the way a room absorbs the arrival of weather, instinctively, before the conscious mind has processed the reason. The music stopped. Claire entered behind them. She was still wearing the gray dress, still had the simple pins in her hair, still wore no jewelry except the thin silver bracelet. She had not changed, had not adjusted anything about herself. And this specifically, was the thing that several people present would return to later, in private, with a discomfort they struggled to name. She looked exactly the same as she had looked 30 minutes earlier when the room had laughed at her. That sameness was the thing, that absolute, unperformed sameness. Damien saw her the moment she entered. She did not look at him. Hawthorne stepped to the center of the room and spoke without a microphone, but with the volume and cadence of a man who had given depositions in federal court and understood exactly how to fill a space with his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting Mr. Moretti's celebration. My name is William Hawthorne, senior partner at Hawthorne, Ellison & Price. I'm here tonight on behalf of the estate of Edward Whitmore, who passed 11 days ago. He let that name settle. It settled the way certain names settle in rooms of powerful people, not with shock, but with a rapid, visible recalibration. Mr. Whitmore's estate is the largest private estate to enter transition in the United States in the past 14 years. It encompasses 47 operating companies across 9 countries, 12 charitable foundations with combined endowments exceeding $4 billion, 17 residential and commercial properties across 3 continents, and controlling shares in institutions spanning banking, shipping, luxury hospitality, and technology infrastructure. He paused. The estate transfers in its entirety, without division or condition, to Mr. Whitmore's sole surviving heir. The room did not breathe. Miss Claire Whitmore. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no gasp, no single visible moment of collapse. What there was instead was something quieter and more total. The specific silence of 500 people simultaneously revising every assumption they had made about the same person, all at once, in the same instant. The sound of that revision was indistinguishable from no sound at all, which made it somehow louder. Damien Moretti stood 12 feet from where Claire had entered. The scotch glass was still in his hand. He had not moved. She still wasn't looking at him. A capo named Benedetto, 40 years old, 20 of them spent learning to read every room Damien Moretti entered, watched his boss's face with the particular attention of a man whose continued health depended on his ability to interpret what he saw there. What he saw there, in the 3 seconds that followed Hawthorne's announcement, he would describe to no one ever. He filed it privately, behind his sternum, and carried it carefully. Victoria Kensington's champagne flute was at her lips when Hawthorne finished speaking. She did not drink from it. She did not lower it. She held it in place for a period that lasted approximately 6 seconds, during which her eyes moved from Hawthorne to Claire to Damien and back to Claire. And something in her face underwent a reorganization that was not visible as individual components, but was unmistakable as a whole, the way a building doesn't look like it's falling until it already has. Claire stood quietly beside Hawthorne and let the room look at her. She had nowhere to be except here, and no version of herself available except this one. She felt the room's attention land on her like a physical weight, distributed, pressing down from all directions simultaneously. And she stood under it with the posture of someone who had learned, in the past hour, that the difference between dignity and collapse was sometimes nothing more than the decision to keep your spine straight. Damien set his glass down on the nearest surface. He moved toward her. The crowd parted without being asked. "Claire." His voice was low, intended to be private, but there were no private spaces in that room anymore. "I need to—" "Mr. Hawthorne." She turned to the attorney without acknowledging Damien's voice, though her shoulders had registered it. He could see that, the small adjustment there, barely visible, the way a structure registers a tremor in its foundation. "Shall we review the transfer documentation?" Hawthorne produced the portfolio. Damien stopped. He stood in the space of perhaps 3 feet between himself and her, and in that space was everything he hadn't said and everything she'd absorbed without speaking, and the sound of the watch hitting the marble floor and the hairspring catching the light. And the crowd saw all of it, or saw none of it, depending on what they were looking at and what they needed to see. He said her name again. "Claire." She signed the first document Hawthorne placed in front of her. The pen moved across the paper with a steadiness that cost her something she didn't have a name for. Damien Moretti walked back to the center of his party. He stood there, in the room he had arranged, and the city he controlled, and the empire he'd built from 35 years of understanding exactly how power worked. And he stood there with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood something he cannot understand. Sal appeared at his elbow. "Boss?" "Give me a drink," Damien said. "You've got one." "Get me another one." The night continued. Events continued. The music resumed after a hesitation that was careful not to last long enough to become significant. Conversations that had paused reopened themselves with the deliberate energy of people who had decided, collectively, that the professional and socially functional response to what had just occurred was to proceed as though it had been merely interesting, rather than foundational. Victoria found Damien at 11:45 near the window, looking at the city. "Well," she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm just saying, Victoria." He turned and looked at her, and his voice had the quality it got when a conversation was over before it had started. "If you are about to tell me something I can learn from, I will listen to it tomorrow. If you are about to tell me something that makes you feel better, I would prefer you didn't." She studied him for a moment with the calculating attention that was her most honest quality. Then she took a small sip of whatever she was drinking and looked back out at the city. "She's already gone," Victoria said. "I checked. The attorneys took her through the service exit 20 minutes ago." Damien said nothing. "You know what I think the interesting part is?" Victoria continued. "She came here tonight planning to tell you. That's what I think. I think she came here to show you who she was, on her own terms, in her own time." She tilted her glass slightly, watching the liquid move. "And you gave her a reason not to." "I didn't ask for your analysis," he said. "No," Victoria agreed. "You asked me to stand beside you and look appropriate. That's what I was doing." She set her glass down. "Good night, Damien." She walked away from the window, and he let her go, and the city below him continued its indifferent operation. 10,000 windows burning in 10,000 buildings full of 10,000 sets of competing interests, and none of them cared. He left the party at midnight. His driver took him to Claire's building on West 73rd Street. He went up without calling ahead. She'd given him a key 8 months ago, and he'd kept it on the same ring as his office key, which he told himself was practical and knew was something else. The apartment was dark. He knocked, waited, knocked again. He let himself in with the key. The apartment was empty of her presence in the way that apartments go empty when someone has been gone for a while rather than just stepped out. Some particular quality of stillness in the air, some arrangement of objects that had been left rather than placed. Her coat was gone. Her work bag was gone from the hook by the door where she always left it. On the kitchen table there was a coffee mug that still held a small amount of cold coffee. Beside it, a slip of paper with a handwritten note that said only, "I had a locksmith change the locks this evening. Please leave the key on the table." She had known he'd come. He stood in the kitchen for a while. He set the key on the table beside the coffee mug. He left. In the car, heading back downtown, Sal watched him from the front seat via the mirror with the careful peripheral attention of a man who had served Damien Moretti for 12 years and understood that the particular quality of silence currently occupying the back seat was a variety that didn't ask for company. Damien looked out the window at the city moving past. He thought about the watch, the hairspring, the 2 evenings she'd told him about once, briefly, laughing at herself. "I held my breath the whole time," she'd said. "I was afraid if I exhaled near it, it would move and I'd have to start over." He hadn't asked what she was working on. He'd been on the phone. He'd kissed the side of her head and gone back to the call. He thought about the estate sale in Connecticut she'd mentioned months ago. He hadn't asked about that either. He thought about how many things she had offered him in the form of casual sentences that he had received as noise and filed as background. He thought about Edward Whitmore, whom he had heard of. The man existed at a level of wealth that was barely visible to the public eye, the kind of money that didn't need to be seen because it had long since passed the point where visibility was necessary, and he thought about what it meant that she had never once said the name to him. He thought about what it meant that she hadn't needed to. The city moved past the window. At 2 in the morning, from inside his apartment, Damien made 3 calls. The first was to a private investigator he trusted with consequential work. The second was to his attorney. The third was to Benedetto, whom he told to quietly, carefully, and with complete discretion, find out where Claire Whitmore was staying. 3 days later, Benedetto came back with an answer. She was not staying anywhere accessible. Hawthorne's firm had moved her into a residence that was connected to the estate's holdings, a property on the Upper East Side that had been in the Whitmore portfolio for 60 years, staffed, secured, and as of the night of Damien's party, effectively a fortress. Not hostile, Benedetto clarified, just closed. The building's private security had politely and professionally declined to accept any message, any package, or any request for contact on Miss Whitmore's behalf. Damien sat with that for a day. Then he tried the gallery where she worked. "Claire Whitmore no longer works here," the woman on the phone said. "When did she leave?" "I'm not able to share that information." He stopped. He wasn't her employer. He wasn't her emergency contact. He wasn't, by any legal or institutional definition, anything to her. "Was it recent?" "I'm not able to share that information," the woman said again and hung up. He tried her phone. The number had been disconnected. Not changed. Disconnected. She had not moved her phone to a new number she didn't want him to have. She had removed herself from the line entirely, the way you remove a thread from a seam. Not cut, but drawn out completely, cleanly, leaving no frayed end to pull on. He stood in his office on the 38th floor of a building that bore no connection to his legal name and stared out at the East River and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only after all the noise of self-deception has been exhausted, what he had done. He had done it in front of 500 people. He had done it because Victoria's laugh had been aimed at him, at his judgment, his discernment, his authority. And in the 2 seconds it took for the room's attention to coalesce around that laugh, he had made a calculation. The calculation was not, how do I protect Claire? The calculation was, how do I recover position? Those two calculations had never conflicted before. He had not known they could. Now he knew. Sal knocked on the office door and entered without waiting, the only person who did that. "There's something you should see," Sal said. He set a tablet on Damien's desk and stepped back. It was security footage. He recognized the ballroom. He recognized the angle, the camera above the main entrance, facing the gift table. High resolution, clean audio. He watched himself pick up the watch. He watched his elbow catch it at the table's edge. He watched the watch fall. He watched himself turn to the next gift without looking at Claire. He watched Claire bend down and pick up the pieces. He watched her walk away. The footage was 43 seconds long. He watched it once. He did not watch it again. "Where did this come from?" he said. "I don't know yet," Sal said, "but I'm not the only one who has it." Damien looked up. "Who else?" Sal's expression gave him the answer before the words did. "It's already moving," Sal said. "Social media, 2 gossip sites, 1 major outlet reached out for comment an hour ago. I've been trying to suppress it, but..." He shook his head once. "It's already moving." Damien pushed the tablet back across the desk. He sat very still for a moment in the particular way that preceded, in Damien Moretti's experience, either violence or something harder than violence, the kind of reckoning that can't be assigned to someone else to handle, that arrives with your name specifically on it and waits. "Who knows it's me?" he said. "Nobody's using your name yet, but the footage is clear. Anyone who is in that room, anyone who knows you." Sal left the rest of it where it was. "And there were a lot of people in that room, boss." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the East River moved with its cold, indifferent patience, carrying things downstream that had no say in the matter. "Get me Caruso," Damien said. Caruso was his crisis attorney, but the one nobody called unless the situation had passed the point where regular attorneys were useful. "Already called him," Sal said. "He's downstairs." Damien stood, straightened his jacket, looked at the river one more time. The footage was already moving through the city's nervous system, frame by frame, 43 seconds of a man making the worst calculation of his life, and the woman whose dignity he'd spent those 43 seconds dismantling was somewhere on the Upper East Side behind a door that had no handle on the outside, and the watch she had spent 6 weeks rebuilding was in pieces in a small clutch bag, and there was nothing in the world that Damien Moretti, who controlled this city's underworld, who had judges and senators and capos who would step in front of a bullet for him, could do to pull those 43 seconds back. He walked toward the door. Behind him, on the desk, the tablet screen went dark. Caruso was already seated when Damien walked into the conference room, a compact man in his late 50s with the kind of stillness that came from spending 3 decades in rooms where the wrong word cost someone everything. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he hadn't uncapped yet, and he looked at Damien the way doctors look at patients who already know the diagnosis but haven't said it out loud. "Close the door," Damien said to Sal. Sal closed it from the outside. "Stayed out." Damien sat down across from Caruso and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the attorney and waited. "The footage has been picked up by 3 outlets as of 40 minutes ago," Caruso said. His voice had the quality of a scalpel. Not unkind, not kind, purely functional. 2 are tabloid adjacent. 1 is not. The non-tabloid outlet is holding for now, pending confirmation of your identity from a second source, but I wouldn't count on that holding past tomorrow morning. Who released it? We don't know yet. Who had access to that camera? Hotel security, hotel management, whoever the hotel security contracts their systems through, and anyone those parties may have shared access with voluntarily or otherwise. Caruso uncapped the pen. That's a wide field. Narrow it. I'm working on it. What I need from you right now is simpler. He set the pen tip to the pad. Is there anything in that footage, or in anything connected to that evening, that creates exposure beyond the reputational? Damien looked at him. Define exposure, Damien said. Criminal, civil, regulatory. Anything that, if a prosecutor or a plaintiff's attorney watched that footage and then started pulling threads, would give them something to hold. The room was quiet for a moment. The party was clean, Damien said. The guest list was managed. Nobody in that room was carrying anything that night. That's not what I asked. Damien met Caruso's eyes. The party was clean, he said again, and the repetition carried the specific weight of a man who was answering the question he'd been asked, and not the question underneath it. Caruso wrote something on the pad. All right, on the reputational side, I can suppress the tabloid material for a while. The non-tabloid outlet is a different problem. If they publish with your name attached, and the footage, the story, becomes about the Moretti family's business interest, and what they say about your judgment, not criminally useful, but socially and corporately damaging. He paused. You have 3 board positions in legitimate companies. 2 of them have morality clauses. I know what I have. Then you know those clauses are at risk. Damien said nothing. There's also the question, Caruso continued carefully, of Miss Whitmore. Specifically whether she or her legal team intends to pursue any civil avenue. What occurred in that ballroom could, in the right framing, constitute, She won't, Damien said. Caruso looked at him. She won't pursue anything, Damien said. That's not how she operates. You haven't spoken to her. I know her. Caruso put his pen down with the deliberate care of a man choosing not to say several things. I would recommend, he said finally, that you not make strategic decisions based on your assessment of someone you haven't spoken to in 4 days and whose circumstances have changed entirely. The words landed flat and stayed there. Damien looked at the table. What's your recommendation? He said. Get ahead of it. Issue a statement tonight acknowledging the footage, expressing regret for the behavior shown, framing it as a private matter in which emotions ran high at a personal event. Caruso picked the pen back up. Don't mention Miss Whitmore by name. Don't mention the estate. Don't say anything that can be construed as an explanation rather than an apology. Apologies that explain are not apologies. And the companies? I'll make calls in the morning. I can manage the board conversations if I have something in writing from you before they see the news. Damien nodded once. Caruso tore the top sheet from the pad and slid it across the table. On it he'd written, in his careful handwriting, a 6-sentence draft. Damien read it. It was precise and bloodless and said what it needed to say with the minimum of material that could be used against him. He read it a second time. Fine, he said. He pushed the sheet back. Caruso folded it into his jacket pocket, capped his pen, and stood. One more thing, the attorney said. He paused with his hands on the back of his chair. The Whitmore estate. You understand what that means in terms of her position relative to yours? Yes. The institutions she now controls include 2 banks that hold paper on 3 of your legitimate companies. Damien went still. I found that out an hour ago, Caruso said. Her grandfather was very deliberate about what he built. Those banking relationships predate your involvement with those companies by 20 years. It's not targeted, it's structural. But it means she's my creditor, Damien said, among other things. Yes. The room held that information without comment. She can't call those notes, Damien said. The terms don't allow, not immediately, no. But at renewal, which for one of them is 14 months away, the new controlling interest in the bank has full discretion on terms renegotiation. Caruso said it evenly. I'm not suggesting she would pursue that avenue. I have no information about her intentions. I'm telling you the structural reality. Damien stood. He stood and walked to the window and put one hand on the glass and looked out at the river and breathed in the way a man breathes when the room has gotten very small without the walls having moved. Get me the statement out by midnight, he said. It'll be out by 11, Caruso said, and left. The statement went out at 11:14. By 11:50, it had been picked up by 4 news aggregators and shared broadly enough that suppressing it became irrelevant. By midnight, the footage itself had migrated beyond the outlets Caruso had identified and was circulating on platforms where suppression was, by the nature of the architecture, a fantasy. Damien watched the numbers from his apartment, not on his phone. He'd given his phone to Sal and told him to filter everything that wasn't operationally critical. He watched on his laptop, in his kitchen, with a glass of water because he'd stopped trusting himself with scotch 2 hours ago. He watched the view count on the footage climb with the particular sickness of someone watching a flood that has already passed the point where sandbags are useful. At 1:20 in the morning, his personal cell, the number known only to the inner circle, rang. He looked at the screen. Marco Vitale. Marco was 64 years old and ran the Vitale family out of Brooklyn with the methodical patience of a man who had survived 4 decades in a business where impatience got people buried. He and Damien's father had come up together. He had attended Damien's father's funeral and sat in the front row and wept without embarrassment, and then gone home and continued doing exactly what he had always done. His calling at 1:20 in the morning was not a social gesture. Damien answered. Marco. You've seen the footage. Not a question. Yes. A pause. Not uncomfortable. Marco Vitale was constitutionally incapable of uncomfortable pauses. He deployed silence the way other men deployed words. There are people talking, he said finally. I know. Not about the footage. About what the footage means about your judgment. Another pause. About whether a man who makes that kind of mistake in public, in a room full of people who needed to see him be solid. Marco stopped there, which was more eloquent than finishing would have been. Damien said nothing. There are 2 families, Marco continued, who are saying very quietly that this raises questions. I'm not naming them tonight, but I'm telling you they exist and they're talking and they're not doing it in my direction, which means they're not looking for my opinion on the matter, which means they've already formed their own. What questions are they raising specifically? The kind a man raises when he wants to know whether someone is still the right person to have on the other side of a table. Marco's voice was even, descriptive rather than accusatory. You embarrassed yourself. That's recoverable. Men have recovered from worse. But you embarrassed yourself in front of people who measure everything. Every handshake, every word, every reaction under pressure. And some of those people are now asking whether what they saw in that footage is the version of Damien Moretti who shows up when something goes wrong. Damien's jaw set. The version of me that shows up when something goes wrong, he said, and his voice had something in it that he pressed down before it could become anything, has never been in question. I know that, Marco said. I'm telling you what other people are saying. I'm telling you because 30 years ago your father did the same for me when I needed someone to tell me something I didn't want to hear. The kitchen was very quiet. I appreciate it, Damien said. He meant it. Fix it, Marco said. Whatever it takes to fix it fast and fix it clean, because the window on this is shorter than you think. He hung up. Damien set the phone down on the counter beside the glass of water and stood in his kitchen at 1:23 in the morning and stared at the surface of the water and watched it hold completely still. He called Sal. "Get me everything on the footage origin," he said. "I want to know who pulled that file from the hotel system, and I want to know it before tomorrow noon. I've got someone on it. Move someone else onto it, too." He hung up, went to the window. The city was doing what it always did at this hour. Not sleeping, exactly, but operating at a frequency that was quieter than the daytime frequency, more honest, less performed. He'd loved this city, at this hour, since he was 19 years old, and running errands for men who'd thought he was unremarkable. He turned that assumption into the first advantage of many. He thought about Marco's words. "The window is shorter than you think." He thought about the 14-month timeline Caruso had mentioned. He thought about Claire on the Upper East Side, behind a door with no exterior handle, and whether she was sleeping, and whether she had eaten, and whether she had put the broken watch pieces somewhere, or still had them in the clutch bag. And then he stopped thinking about that because it was not useful, and he had trained himself over 35 years to stop thinking about things that were not useful. He was not entirely successful. At 9:40 the following morning, Sal appeared in Damien's office doorway with an expression that was not any of the expressions he normally wore. "Close the door," Damien said. Sal closed it, sat down, put a folder on the desk without opening it. "The footage," he said. "I know who pulled it." Damien waited. The hotel's security contractor uses a third-party monitoring service for archival retrieval. The request for that specific footage, that specific camera, that specific time window, it was filed the morning after the party. Sal's voice was careful, level. Filed under a service account registered to Kensington Event Management. The office went silent. "That's Victoria's company," Damien said. "Her company uses that hotel for events 4 or 5 times a year. She had a legitimate service relationship with the contractor. The access request didn't look unusual in the system." Sal paused. "But it was hers." Damien did not move. "She pulled the footage the morning after your party," Sal said, "and 48 hours later it started moving." The silence stretched. Damien looked at the closed folder on his desk. "Is this confirmed?" 3 independent sources: the access log, the service account registration trail, and a contractor employee who remembers the request because it came in early and was flagged internally as unusual before someone senior cleared it. Sal opened the folder now and turned it to face Damien. "It's confirmed." Damien looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Victoria had stood beside him at the window the night of the party and told him Claire was already gone. She had told him what she thought the interesting part was. She had said, "You gave her a reason not to." She had said goodnight and walked away and left him standing there. And the morning after, before the city had finished processing what had happened in that ballroom, she had filed a request for the security footage. Not because she was angry, not in heat. In the morning, with deliberation, with the particular patience of someone executing something they'd decided on before the evening was over. Damien closed the folder. "Where is she?" he said. His voice had a quality that Sal recognized from a small number of previous occasions. Not loud, not heated. Exactly the opposite, a very specific kind of quiet that meant the volume and heat had been removed from the room by force, and what was left was something considerably more serious than either. "Her apartment, best we know. She hasn't left since last night." Damien stood. "I'm coming," Sal said immediately. "No." Damien picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "You're staying here. You're continuing to build the documentation on the access trail, and you're preparing a full account for Caruso. I want everything on paper, time-stamped, sourced." He put the jacket on. "I'll handle Victoria myself." "Boss?" "Sal?" Just the name, with a finality that closed the conversation like a physical door. He drove himself, which he rarely did. A black sedan, nothing conspicuous. The kind of vehicle that moved through Manhattan without accumulating attention. He needed the drive. He needed the 12 minutes between his building and Victoria's to do something with the particular quality of what was moving through his chest, which was not rage in the way he usually experienced rage. Hot, combustible, clarifying. But something colder and more structural. The way ice damages a building not by burning it, but by expanding slowly inside the walls until the seams give. She had used his name. Not directly. The footage didn't name him. The outlets hadn't named him yet. But she had deployed the footage knowing exactly whose face it showed and exactly what that face meant to exactly the people who would see it. She had sat beside him at the window and delivered her small, intelligent analysis of what he'd done wrong. And the morning after, she had ensured that analysis would be shared with the world. Not out of love, not out of injury, out of calculation. Because that was what Victoria Kensington was, at the bottom of everything. Not a socialite, not an ally, not even an ambitious woman in the ordinary sense of that phrase, but a calculator of the purest variety. And she had calculated that Damien Moretti diminished was more useful to her than Damien Moretti intact. He understood now, standing in the elevator of her building, why she had spent 2 years positioning herself beside him. Not to be with him, to be adjacent to him, to be close enough that when the structure shifted, she was already in the right place to benefit from the movement. She opened the door on the second knock. She was wearing a robe, holding coffee, and her expression when she saw him moved through 3 phases in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, then a very fast recalibration, then something that settled into the particular composure of a person who is prepared for a version of this moment and has decided to meet it on their feet. "Damien," she said. Her voice was smooth. Not entirely. The smoothness was applied over something else. "Can I come in?" he said. Not a question. She stepped back. He walked past her into the apartment, into her living room with its curated furniture and its considered art and its east-facing windows that caught the morning light in a way that had clearly been accounted for in the original design. And he stood in the center of it and turned to face her and waited while she closed the door and came into the room. She sat down. He didn't. "The footage," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with the steadiness of a woman who had decided that her best available option was complete composure, deployed early, held without flinching. "What about it?" she said. "You pulled it from the hotel system, the morning after the party." A pause. Brief. She recalibrated inside it. "That's a significant accusation." "It's not an accusation," he said. "I have the access logs. I have the service account trail. I have a contractor who remembers the request." He watched her face. "I'm not asking whether you did it. I'm asking why." The composure held for another 3 seconds. Then she set the coffee cup down on the table beside her with a precision that was itself a kind of answer. Too careful, the placement of someone buying time through gesture. "You humiliated her in front of everyone," Victoria said, "in front of people who will remember it forever. And you did it because I laughed." Her voice had changed register, no longer smooth, but not heated either, something harder underneath. "You did it because I made a small sound and you turned it into theater. And I watched you do it, and I thought, this is who he is when it matters. This is the man I've been standing next to. So you released the footage. I made sure it existed somewhere you couldn't erase it." Her eyes were level on his. "Yes? You made sure the story got out. I made sure you couldn't pretend it didn't happen." Something moved across her face that was not guilt and was not entirely without it either. Something more complicated, residing in the territory between righteous and self-serving that people occupied when both things were simultaneously true. You were going to manage it, suppress it, make it go away. That's what you do. You make things go away. "You made it go away too," Damien said quietly. "Just in a different direction. You made me go away." Her jaw tightened. "The 2 families who are questioning my judgment," he said. "Did you speak to them?" A silence. "Victoria, I didn't tell them anything that wasn't already. Did you speak to them?" The silence this time was the answer. He stood in the center of her living room and looked at her and felt the cold thing in his chest expand another fraction, pressing outward, testing the seams. She had moved through this city beside him for 2 years. She had sat at tables where things were said that were never written down. She had been in rooms where the identities of the people present were the most sensitive information in the space. "You went to Mancini and Ferraro," he said. The names of the 2 families Marco hadn't named. He could see it in the timing of her silence. "You went to them before the footage dropped." "I didn't go to them," she said. "I had a conversation." "You had a conversation about my judgment with 2 families who are now questioning whether I should be sitting at any of the tables I sit at." His voice was still quiet. It was the quietest it had been in the conversation. You understand what that means. She looked at him, and he saw something in her face that he might, under different circumstances, have identified as fear, except that it wasn't fear in the ordinary sense. It was the particular expression of someone who has made a large move in a game and is now watching the board reconfigure in ways they had partially anticipated and partially not. You were going to lose everything anyway, she said. The footage was going to get out eventually. The estate story was going to come out. Her attorneys were going to make sure people understood what you'd done and who she was and what that meant about you. She leaned forward slightly. I just controlled the timing. You controlled the timing, he repeated. Yes. For my benefit. She said nothing. Victoria. He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it over a chair. If you had come to me, if you had told me what you knew, what you saw, what you were thinking, I would have listened. Would you? She said. You didn't listen to her. For 2 years you didn't listen to her. He put the jacket on. This conversation is the last one we'll have, he said. On any subject. I'll have Sal reach out to your attorney about the service account documentation and what I intend to do with it. That conversation will be between them. He walked to the door. Damien. Her voice followed him, and something in it had changed. Not softer, but stripped of the composed surface, reaching the layer underneath that was less calculated, less controlled, more honest, and therefore more difficult. I did it because you chose a room full of strangers over the one person in it who actually saw you, and I couldn't stand watching you not understand what you'd lost. He stood with his hand on the door. Neither could I, he said. He left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling and breathed through the nose and out through the mouth, the way he'd learned to breathe in situations where the body wanted to do something the mind needed to prevent. The cage descended. His reflection moved in the polished door. Jacket, careful face, the hands that had set a pocket watch at the edge of a table and let his elbow find it. He had lost Claire to his own calculation. He had lost the protection of obscurity to Victoria's. And now, from the messages already accumulating on Sal's filtered phone, messages from Caruso, from board members, from one number he recognized as belonging to someone in the DA's office who had been quietly friendly for 3 years and was apparently reevaluating the nature of that friendship. The consequences were arriving not in sequence but simultaneously, from every direction at once, the way water arrives when a structure finally gives. He walked out of Victoria's building into the morning light and stood on the sidewalk, and the city moved around him with its absolute indifference. And for the first time in his adult life, Damien Moretti felt the particular vertigo of a man who has built his entire existence on the assumption that he could calculate his way out of anything, standing at the edge of something he could not calculate his way out of. His phone, not Sal's filtered line, buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. But the area code was one he recognized. The exchange used by Hawthorne, Ellison, and Price. He stared at it through 2 rings. Then he answered. He answered on the 3rd ring. Mr. Moretti. The voice on the other end was young, professional, carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who had been told exactly what to say and had prepared to say it. I'm calling on behalf of William Hawthorne at Hawthorne, Ellison, and Price. Mr. Hawthorne would like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss several matters of mutual financial concern. Damien stood on the sidewalk outside Victoria's building with the morning moving around him. When? He said. Today, if possible. Mr. Hawthorne has availability at 2 o'clock. Where? Our office is on Park Avenue. I'll text the suite number to this number. Fine, Damien said. He hung up. He stood there for another 10 seconds, the phone in his hand, the city doing what it did. A cab went past. A delivery truck blocked the intersection to his left, and the driver leaned on the horn once, briefly, then gave up. 2 women in exercise clothes walked by, talking about something that had nothing to do with him. 14 months until the banknote came up for renewal. He was now receiving calls from her attorney's office. He put the phone in his pocket and walked to his car. Sal was in the office when Damien got back, sitting at the secondary desk with 3 laptops open and a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He looked up when Damien came in and read whatever was on Damien's face with the efficiency of 12 years' practice. "Hawthorne's office called me," Damien said. 2 o'clock meeting." Sal said nothing for a moment. "That's fast." "Yes." "You're going?" "Yes." Damien sat down behind his desk. "Get me Caruso on the phone. Now, not in an hour." While Sal made the call, Damien opened his laptop and pulled up the financial architecture of the 3 companies that held paper through the Whitmore banking interests. He'd looked at this before, perfunctorily, the way a man looks at infrastructure that has always functioned correctly, the way you look at load-bearing walls without thinking about load. Now he looked at it the way a structural engineer looks at a wall after a tremor, with the specific attention of someone who needs to know exactly how much is resting on what. The numbers were not good. Not catastrophic? Not yet. But the word yet was doing significant work in that assessment. Caruso came on the line. "I have a 2 o'clock with Hawthorne," Damien said. A pause. "That was fast." "Everyone keeps saying that. Tell me what it means." "It means they know exactly what the financial exposure looks like from their side, and they want to have the conversation before you have time to build a defensive position." Caruso's voice was measured, precise. "Or it means they want to offer you something, and they want to do it before the news cycle solidifies the narrative further. Those are the 2 most likely possibilities." "Which do you think?" "I don't know enough about what she wants," Caruso said. "Does she want to damage you, or does she want something specific?" "I don't know what she wants," Damien said. "We haven't spoken." Another pause, more deliberate this time. "You're going into a meeting with her legal team without knowing her objective." "That appears to be the situation." "Damien," Caruso used his first name rarely, "I need to be in that room." "You will be." He hung up, looked at the financial documents again, then closed the laptop and looked at the wall. He thought about what she wanted. He had been thinking about it since the elevator, since the sidewalk, since the drive back, and the honest answer, the answer underneath the professional analysis and the strategic calculation, was that he didn't know. And the reason he didn't know was that he had spent 2 years with her and had systematically failed to understand what she wanted because he had not, in any sustained or serious way, asked. He had assumed. He had assumed she wanted what women in proximity to his world generally wanted: the security, the access, the specific glamour of being beside a man who moved through rooms the way Damien Moretti moved through rooms. He had assumed this not because he was a fool, but because he was a man who had learned to read rooms full of powerful and dangerous people and had never applied that same reading to the woman sitting across from him at dinner. He had been good at her face when it was happy. He had been poor at her face when it was trying to tell him something else. Sal knocked on the open door. "Car's ready for 2 o'clock when you are. Also," he stopped. "What?" "The Mancini family reached out." Sal's voice had the particular flatness it got when the news was bad, and he'd had time to flatten his reaction to it. "Not Mancini directly. His son. He wants a sit-down." "When?" "He suggested this week. His framing was—" Sal paused, choosing words. "He called it a conversation between friends who want to remain friends." The language was precise, and everyone in Damien's world understood exactly what it meant. This is a conversation we're having before it becomes a different kind of conversation. "Thursday," Damien said. "I'll sit with him Thursday. I'll set it up." Sal left. Damien sat in his office for another 20 minutes and did not look at his phone and did not look at the laptop and did not move much. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who is spending the last available minutes of quiet before something begins that will not stop until it is finished. At 1:45, he put on his jacket and went downstairs. The offices of Hawthorne, Ellison, and Price occupied 4 floors of a Park Avenue building that had been built in an era when the word discretion was architectural as well as professional. The lobby had no signage beyond a small brass plate beside the elevator bank. The receptionist at the 32nd floor was a woman of perhaps 50, who looked at Damien and Caruso with the neutral courtesy of someone who had received consequential people in this space for decades and had no remaining capacity to be impressed by any of them. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you," she said, as though there had been any doubt, and led them down a corridor lined with no art, no photographs, only the particular quality of silence that money buys when it has enough of itself to stop performing. The conference room was large and faced north. 4 chairs on one side of the table. William Hawthorne sat in the center, with 2 attorneys flanking him. The 4th chair on his side was empty. Damien registered the empty chair immediately. She wasn't here. He sat across from Hawthorne, and Caruso sat beside him, and the pleasantries, such as they were, lasted approximately 90 seconds before Hawthorne folded his hands on the table and looked at Damien with the expression of a man who had sat in this chair for 31 years on behalf of clients who trusted him with things they didn't trust anyone else with. "Mr. Moretti," Hawthorne said, "I'll be direct. Miss Whitmore asked me to open this conversation with a question rather than a position." He paused. "The question is, are you here because you're concerned about the financial exposure, or because you want to speak to her?" The room was very still. Damien looked at Hawthorne. "Both," he said. Hawthorne held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slightly. "That's an honest answer. All right." He opened the portfolio in front of him. On the financial side, the Whitmore estate holds controlling interest in First Meridian Trust and in Atlantic Continental Savings, both of which carry outstanding notes on 3 companies in your portfolio: Moretti Development LLC, Carlisle Property Group, and Northgate Logistics. Combined exposure is approximately $41 million. The notes are all within their term periods. None of them are callable at this time. "I'm aware," Caruso said. "I know you're aware," Hawthorne said, without heat. "I'm establishing the foundation of the conversation." He turned a page. "Miss Whitmore has no intention of using those notes as leverage. That is not why we called this meeting." A pause. Damien said, "Then why?" Hawthorne looked at him directly. "Because she wanted you to hear that from us formally, on record, before the news cycle made you believe otherwise. She didn't want you spending the next 14 months operating under a threat that doesn't exist." He closed the portfolio. "That's the financial matter. She asked us to handle it, and we've handled it." Caruso made a note. Damien looked at the empty chair. "She's not coming," he said. "No," Hawthorne said. "Was that also her decision?" "Everything in this meeting reflects her decisions." Damien put both hands flat on the table, the same gesture he'd used with Caruso 2 days ago, the gesture of a man establishing physical contact with something solid when everything around him has gone uncertain. "I want to speak to her, but," he said. "I know," Hawthorne said. "She knows." "Then why?" "Because she's not ready," Hawthorne said, and something in his voice shifted very slightly, not away from professional and toward personal exactly, but a fraction in that direction, enough to indicate that he had known Claire Whitmore longer than this conversation and had opinions about her situation that his professional role required him not to express. And because the last time she was in a room where you were the most powerful person present, you used that room against her. He let that sit for a moment. "She'll speak to you when she's ready. She wanted you to know that she will. Eventually. On her terms." "When?" Damien said. "That's not information I have." Caruso put his hand on Damien's arm. A brief, firm contact, the practiced restraint of a man who had interrupted more productive things from that gesture. Damien registered it and sat back. "Is there anything she needs?" Damien said. "Anything I can—" He stopped because the sentence had no good ending, and he knew it, and Hawthorne knew it. "Miss Whitmore's needs are well addressed," Hawthorne said, not unkindly. "She has the resources of the most significant private estate transition in 14 years behind her. She has people she trusts. She has time, which I think is the thing she needs most." He paused. "What I'd suggest to you, Mr. Moretti, is to use the same time." Damien looked at him. "To do what?" he said. "I imagine you can answer that better than I can," Hawthorne said. The meeting ended 11 minutes later. They shook hands with the specific formality of people who have exchanged significant information and are acknowledging it without dramatizing it, and Damien and Caruso rode the elevator down in silence and walked out onto Park Avenue into an afternoon that had gotten colder since morning, a wind coming down from the north that had teeth. "She's protecting you," Caruso said. Damien looked at him. "Formally, on record, having her attorney state explicitly that the banknotes won't be weaponized." Caruso turned up his collar against the wind. "She didn't have to do that. Most people in her position, with the leverage she has, would let you sit with the uncertainty. Let you negotiate from a position of fear. He glanced at Damien. She's removing the fear deliberately. Why? That, Caruso said, is the question. He got into his car and left. Damien stood on Park Avenue. He stood there long enough that Sal, watching from the sedan 20 feet away, got out of the car and came to stand beside him without speaking, which was one of Sal's genuinely useful qualities, the ability to be present without requiring the space to be filled. She told her attorney to tell me the notes were clean, Damien said. I heard, Sal said. He'd been in the room. What do you want to do? Damien looked up at the building. 32 floors. 4 floors of people who had spent decades protecting the interests of someone who had just used their resources to protect his. I want to fix it, he said. You can't fix it from the outside of a door she controls, Sal said. I know. So what does that mean? Damien looked at him. It means I earned the door. He got in the car. 3 days later, he sat across from Paolo Mancini Jr. in the private dining room of a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that the Mancini family had owned for 20 years. Red walls, low light, the smell of garlic and red wine and old wood, the kind of room where the ambiance was a deliberate message about permanence and ownership. Paolo Jr. was 38, a generation younger than his father, educated at Fordham, and possessed of the particular quality of a man who has grown up watching power operate and has developed his own ideas about how it should work. He was also, Damien had always thought, someone to be watched carefully, not feared, watched. They ate for 15 minutes before Paolo Jr. set his fork down and looked at Damien with the directness that was partly his nature and partly, Damien suspected, a performance of his nature. My father wanted me to convey his continued respect, Paolo Jr. said. Convey mine in return, Damien said. He also wanted me to say, Paolo Jr. reached for his wine, turned the glass slowly, didn't drink. That the families value stability above most things. You know this. I know this. And that recent events have created a perception, not a reality. He was careful with the distinction. A perception that the Moretti position may be less stable than it has historically been. That perception is wrong, Damien said. I believe you, Paolo Jr. said, in a tone that indicated belief was not the operative variable. But perception operates independently of reality, as I'm sure you know. And perception, once established, requires active management to correct. He set the wine glass down. My father's concern, and when I say my father's concern, I mean the concern of several people who communicate through my father, is that the active management of this particular perception may require resources and attention that distract from the stability of existing arrangements. Damien held Paolo Jr.'s gaze steadily. Tell your father and the people who communicate through him that the existing arrangements are protected. They will continue to function exactly as they have. The perception you're describing is a product of a personal matter that has been addressed and will not recur. The footage is still circulating, Paolo Jr. said. Footage circulates. Then it stops circulating. Damien picked up his own wine glass. People have short attention spans for everything except what directly affects them. The people you're describing are not affected by a personal incident at a private party. They're affected by what it suggests about judgment, Paolo Jr. said. Directly. No longer performing around it. The table went quiet for a moment. Damien set his glass down. My judgment has been consistent for 15 years, he said. One night in 15 years does not constitute a pattern. If the families require a pattern before they reevaluate a perception, they'll be waiting a long time because there won't be one. He looked at Paolo Jr. without aggression and without apology. If they're not willing to wait, that's a different conversation, and it's one I'd prefer to have directly rather than through intermediaries. Paolo Jr. looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork. I'll communicate that, he said. Accurately. I trust you will, Damien said. They finished dinner. The conversation moved to other things. Logistics, pending matters, the operational details that formed the actual substance of what the families managed together. Paolo Jr. was precise and competent, and his father's son in the ways that mattered. And when they shook hands outside the restaurant, the handshake had a quality that was, if not entirely repaired, at least no longer actively breaking. Sal drove home in silence. Damien sat in the back and watched the Brooklyn Bridge go by and thought about what Paolo Jr. had said about perception and reality operating independently, and thought about the 43 seconds of footage still circulating through the city's nervous system, and thought about a conference room on Park Avenue with an empty chair. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. An unknown number, not the Hawthorne Exchange this time. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Silence on the line for a moment. Then a sound. The particular ambient texture of someone who is in a specific place, a quiet place, a place with good acoustics and high ceilings, the kind of sound that, "I got your letter," Claire said. His hand tightened on the phone without his permission. "It wasn't a letter," he said. His voice came out lower than intended. "It was a statement my attorney released." "I know what it was." She paused. "I'm calling because Hawthorne told me about the meeting, about what you said." Another pause, shorter. "That you wanted to speak to me." "Yes," he said. "I'm not ready for that," she said. "I know. Hawthorne told me." "Then why are you—" She stopped, started again. "I'm calling because I want you to know something directly, not through attorneys." Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been decided before the conversation, when the person speaking has rehearsed the emotional content out of the words in advance. "I'm not your enemy. I'm not going to use what I have against you. I want you to know that not because I need you to feel relieved, but because I don't want to be the kind of person who lets someone live under a threat that doesn't exist." Damien closed his eyes briefly. "Claire, don't." The word was not loud. It was a wall. "I'm not finished." A breath. He could hear the breath. "What you did that night, I've thought about it every day since. Not because I'm angry. I'm past angry." She paused. "What I keep coming back to is the 2 seconds. The 2 seconds between Victoria's laugh and your decision. I've thought about those 2 seconds more than anything else, because in those 2 seconds you made a choice. And the choice wasn't about me. The choice was about the room, about what the room would think of you." Her voice stayed level. "I need you to understand that before we ever speak again. Not to apologize. Not to feel bad about it. Just to understand it completely." Damien sat in the back of the moving car. The bridge was gone. They were on the FDR now, the river a dark strip to the right, the city's east face moving past the window. "I understand it," he said. "Do you?" "Yes." He paused. "It was the worst 2 seconds of my life. And they lasted longer than 2 seconds. They're still going." Silence on the line. "I know," she said quietly. "I can hear that." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not ready to see you. I don't know when I will be. But I wanted you to know that eventually, when I am, I'll call." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She stayed on the line for another 3 seconds without speaking. He didn't fill it. Then the line went quiet. He lowered the phone. Sal watched him in the mirror, said nothing. Damien looked out at the river. She had called him. She had not been ready to call him, and she had called him anyway, and she had said what she said with the precision of someone who had decided exactly what they needed to give and had given precisely that. Not more, not less. And had hung up and left him with it. He thought about the 2 seconds she'd described. He thought about them with the specific attention of a man who is looking at something he has previously refused to look at directly, finally holding still long enough to see its actual shape. The car moved north. 3 weeks later, the first board resignation came. A member of the Carlisle Property Group board who cited personal reasons in his letter and did not request a meeting. 3 days after that, a second. The corporate structure was not collapsing. Caruso had done his work. The morality clause conversations had been managed. The direct financial exposure had been contained. But it was contracting quietly, the way things contract when the confidence that held them expanded begins to cool. The media had moved on from the footage, mostly. It existed as a layer of sediment now, findable, referenced, no longer generating new heat but not gone. It would be findable for the rest of his life. That was simply the geography of it now, and he had stopped spending energy on the impossibility of changing it. He was in his office on a Tuesday afternoon going through contracts when Sal knocked. "The DA's office," Sal said. Damien looked up. "Directly?" he said. "Directly." Sal's face was careful. "The contact. The one who has been friendly for 3 years." "Reyes," Damien said. "He's not calling as a friendly contact anymore," Sal said. "He's calling as an ADA. He wants to sit down, informally." Sal paused. He was specific about the word informally. The room went very still. In 12 years of the Moretti Syndicate operating at the level it operated at, they had maintained one fundamental principle above all others: keep the criminal and legitimate structures so thoroughly separated that no thread between them was findable, and maintain relationships with people in positions of oversight that were genuine enough to generate early warning when the wind changed direction. The wind was changing direction. "Tell him Thursday," Damien said. "Same place I met Reyes last time." He suggested his office. "Tell him Thursday. Same place." Sal nodded and left. Damien sat at his desk and looked at the contracts in front of him and did not see them. He looked through them at the shape of what was assembling itself around him. Not an attack, not yet, but a closing of distances, a contraction of the space he operated in, the particular geometry of a situation that has not yet become critical, but is moving toward critical with a momentum that required him to make decisions now, while there was still space to make them in. Victoria had gone to Mancini and Ferraro. Mancini and Ferraro had communicated concerns to other families. Other families had generated noise that had reached the DA's office's awareness through channels that he could trace if he spent the time on it. All of it originating, directly or indirectly, from 43 seconds of footage in a ballroom on December 14th. All of it originating from 2 seconds at a birthday party. He picked up his phone. He did not call Claire. He had promised himself he would not call her, that he would wait, that he would give her the time she had asked for and had been explicit about needing, that he would not treat her request for space as something to be managed around. He had promised himself this and was keeping it with the grim discipline of a man who has very few remaining certainties and is holding hard to the ones he has. He called Benedetto. "I need you to do something for me," he said, "and I need it done quietly, without documentation and without asking me why." "Of course," Benedetto said. "The security footage from the Carlisle Grand, the original file. I need you to find out whether there are other copies, but not the circulating version, the original hotel archive file, and whether those copies have been accessed by anyone outside the chain, I already know about." A pause. "You think there's more of it?" "I think Victoria had a reason to access the system that morning specifically," Damien said. "I think she was looking for something specific, and I think the 43 seconds of footage the world has seen may not be the only thing she found." Silence on the line. "How long do you need?" Damien asked. "Give me 48 hours, Benedetto said. Damien hung up. He sat in the office as the afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow way it moved in winter, that low-angle northern light that reached further into the room than summer light did, that found corners that spent the rest of the year in shadow and illuminated them with the particular mercilessness of a season that had no interest in flattery. 48 hours. He did not know what Benedetto would find. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent 15 years reading situations that were trying to kill him, that the 43 seconds the world had seen were not the end of what Victoria had taken from that archive, and that whatever else she had taken was either already in motion or was being held in reserve for a moment she had not yet identified, and that the difference between those two possibilities was the difference between a problem he could still manage and one that had already managed him. His phone buzzed on the desk. Sal's number. He picked it up. "The DA's office called back," Sal said. "Reyes says Thursday doesn't work. He says it needs to be tomorrow." Damien sat very still. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow morning." He said, Sal paused. "He said he's trying to give you the opportunity to have this conversation before it becomes a different kind of conversation." The same phrase Paolo Mancini Jr. had used, word for word, which meant it wasn't a coincidence and it wasn't Paolo Jr.'s phrase, and whoever had handed those words to both of them was someone who moved between the families and the DA's office with enough ease to deliver the same message in two different rooms, And that person was not someone Damien had accounted for in any of his calculations. "Tell him tomorrow," Damien said. He set the phone down. Outside the window, the East River moved with its dark and indifferent current, carrying things that had no say in the matter. And the city stood on both its banks and hummed with the electricity of 10,000 simultaneous forces pulling in 10,000 directions. And somewhere in that city, in a building on the Upper East Side, Claire Whitmore was doing whatever she was doing, reading, working, building something out of the wreckage of the last several months. And she did not know what was assembling itself around him. And he was not going to tell her, because some things a man carries alone not out of pride, but out of the recognition that they belong to him and no one else. And this was his. This entire architecture of consequence, built from 2 seconds of the worst judgment of his life. He opened the desk drawer. Inside, wrapped in a cloth he'd found in his kitchen, were the broken pieces of the antique pocket watch, retrieved, without a word to anyone, from the marble floor of the Carlisle Grand the morning after the party, before the cleaning crew had made their rounds. He hadn't told Sal, hadn't told anyone. He picked up the largest piece, the case, cracked along its spine but holding its shape, and held it in his palm and looked at it and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of the thing and also the weight of everything the thing stood for. And these were not the same weight, but they occupied the same hand. Tomorrow morning, the DA's office. Something that Reyes was trying to give him the opportunity to have before it became a different kind of conversation. He set the watch piece back in the drawer and closed it. He picked up his phone and called Caruso. "I need you at my office tonight," he said. "Bring everything." Caruso arrived at 9:47 with 2 associates and a rolling case that contained, as far as Damien could tell, every document that had ever passed through the legitimate side of his financial life. They worked until 2 in the morning. The conference table disappeared under paper, corporate filings, loan agreements, board minutes, correspondence, the entire paper skeleton of everything Damien Moretti had spent 15 years building on the surface of the other thing he had spent 15 years building underneath. At 2:15, Caruso sat back in his chair and took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers and said, "The legitimate exposure is manageable. There's nothing in here that a competent prosecutor can use as a bridge to the other side. The separation is held." "Then what does Reyes want?" Damien said. "He wants you to know it's held," Caruso said. "He wants to sit across from you and tell you that he knows what you are, and that the case for what he knows isn't there and may never be there, and he wants to watch your face when he says it." He put his glasses back on. "That's what tomorrow morning is." Damien looked at him. "He's not coming with an offer," Caruso continued. "He's not coming with a threat he can execute. He's coming to establish that he exists in your life now, that the distance between your world and his office has shortened and is going to stay shortened." He paused. "It's a message, delivered in person because in-person messages land differently than the other kind." "Who sent it?" Damien said. That's the question." "Victoria," Damien said. "Possibly, probably, given the timeline. But Victoria would need a direct line to Reyes, and that line would need to have been established before the footage dropped, which means she was building this before the party," Damien said. The room was quiet. "She was beside you for 2 years," Caruso said carefully. Damien sat with that. 2 years. The dinners, the events, the rooms where things were said, the particular intelligence of someone who listened well and asked questions that seemed social and retained everything. He thought about Victoria at the window on the night of the party, saying, "I watched you do it, and I thought, this is who he is when it matters." He had heard that as analysis. He was now hearing it as something else, as a woman who had been watching him for 2 years with a dual-purpose attention, waiting for the moment when what she'd gathered became useful. "She built a file," Damien said. "I think she built a relationship," Caruso said, "with someone in a position to receive a file." Damien stood up. He walked to the window and put his hand on the glass and looked out at the city at 2 in the morning, its reduced and honest nighttime frequency, the lights burning in buildings full of people who were sleeping or working or lying awake with their own versions of this, whatever this was for each of them. "Can we prove it?" he said. "Prove what, specifically?" "That she went to Reyes, that she built the relationship, that what's happening now is the product of 2 years of deliberate construction, not a response to one night." Caruso was quiet for a moment. With time and resources, possibly, but proving it doesn't undo it. He paused. And pursuing it keeps you in a posture that isn't productive. Damien turned from the window. What posture is productive? He said. One that demonstrates the separation is held. One that shows the legitimate companies continue to operate correctly. One that makes the cost of continued attention higher than the benefit. Caruso's voice was steady and practiced and entirely without sentiment, which was what Damien was paying for. You survive this by making it boring, not by fighting it. Damien looked at him for a long time. Make it boring, he said. Make it boring, Caruso confirmed. They shook hands at 2:40. The associates packed the rolling case. Damien saw them to the elevator and then went back to his office and sat in the dark for a while and did not turn the lights back on and did not call anyone and did not look at his phone. He opened the desk drawer. He took out the broken watch case and held it in both hands this time, not one. The crack along the spine caught a line of light from the window. The hinge still worked. He'd noticed that when he retrieved it, the hinge was undamaged, only the case itself had fractured when it hit the marble. The mechanism was inside and was in more pieces than the case, and the hairspring she had spent 2 evenings aligning was bent out of true, and none of this was fixable by him. He didn't have her hands, or her patience, or her knowledge of the specific language that broken things spoke to people who understood how to listen to them. He closed the case gently, put it back in the drawer. He went home at 3 and slept 4 hours and was back in the car by 7:45. The meeting with Reyes lasted 53 minutes. Ada Marcus Reyes was 41 years old, lean and careful in the way of someone who had grown up being underestimated and had learned to weaponize it. He sat across from Damien and Caruso in a conference room that was aggressively ordinary. Fluorescent lighting, laminate table, chairs that had seen better years. And he looked at Damien with the specific attention of a man who has thought about this meeting for a while. "Thank you for coming," Reyes said. "Of course," Damien said. "I'll be direct." He opened a folder, looked at it, closed it again, which told Damien the folder was a prop. He already knew everything in it. There have been some conversations in the past several weeks that have generated renewed interest in the Moretti family's business activities. I'm not going to characterize the source of those conversations. I'm going to tell you that they happened and that they resulted in a review of existing files. "And what did the review find?" Caruso said. "Nothing actionable," Reyes said. His eyes were on Damien while he said it. "Nothing that isn't already known, documented, and either closed or in a holding pattern that has been in a holding pattern for a long time." He paused. "The separation between Mr. Moretti's legitimate enterprises and any other activities has been, from our perspective, consistent." "Then the purpose of this meeting," Caruso said, "is to be honest about the landscape." Reyes folded his hands. "The conversations that generated the review. I think you know where they came from. I think you've known for a while. What I want you to understand is that the source of those conversations is no longer in a position to generate new ones. The relationship between that source and this office has been evaluated." He chose the word carefully. "And found to lack the credibility required to continue." Damien sat very still. "Victoria Kensington," he said. Reyes looked at him for a moment. "I'm not confirming names in this room." "You don't need to," Damien said. "What I will confirm," Reyes said, "is that someone who represented themselves as having access to significant information about the Moretti family's operations was found, upon examination, to have been operating with motivations that were personal rather than civic. And information provided under those conditions has a different evidentiary weight than information provided otherwise." He paused. "This office doesn't pursue cases built on personal vendettas. We've made that determination." The fluorescent light hummed above them. "She went to you directly," Damien said. "I'm not—" "She came to your office, in person, with a file." Damien's voice was even, descriptive, not heated. "Before the party, before the footage, she had been building a relationship with someone in this office for longer than the recent events." Reyes looked at him. "This meeting," Reyes said carefully, "is about the current landscape, not historical chronology." Which was confirmation. Damien nodded once. "I understand." "Good." Reyes uncrossed his hands. "Then I think we've covered what needed to be covered." He stood. Mr. Moretti, I'm going to say something that isn't part of the official record of this conversation. Damien waited. Whatever happened at that party, Reyes said, and whatever came after it, the way it got used was wrong. By people who should have had better purposes. He paused. I'm not in the business of defending you, but I'm also not in the business of letting someone else's personal agenda drive this office's resources. He extended his hand. We're done here. They shook hands. In the elevator going down, Caruso said nothing for the first 2 floors. Then, it's over. Victoria, Damien said. She overplayed it. She built something on personal motivation and presented it as civic information, and when they looked at it closely enough, the motivation showed through. Caruso's voice had a quality that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction, but was somewhere between them. She's finished in this city. Anyone she approaches now, in any context, the first call they'll make is to verify whether she's operating on personal agenda again. Damien looked at the elevator doors. She had 2 years of access to rooms where things were said, he said. She did, Caruso said, and she used it all on one move. And the move failed. He paused. That's a very expensive mistake. They walked out onto the street. The morning was sharp and clear, a January cold that had none of December's ambiguity. It was simply and completely cold, the air cleaned out, the sky a hard, flat blue. Damien stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in and felt it reach his lungs and felt something in his chest that he didn't have an immediate word for. Not relief. Something quieter than relief. Something that would need time to identify itself. Go home, Caruso said. Not to the office. Home. Damien looked at him. You've been managing this for 6 weeks without stopping, Caruso said. It's managed. Go home. He went home. He sat in his apartment for the first time in weeks without the specific weight of an immediate crisis pressing on every surface. The apartment was large and well-furnished, and had the quality of a place that had been designed for a version of his life that had not entirely materialized. Too formal, too considered, a stage set for a performance that had never quite run as written. He'd never noticed that before. He noticed it now. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about what Hawthorne had said. Use the time. He thought about what that meant. Over the following weeks, he began to understand what it meant in practical terms. It meant dismantling the things that had been built for appearances rather than purpose. It meant having conversations with his capos that were different from the conversations they'd had before, quieter, more honest, less about the performance of authority and more about what the work actually was and who it actually affected. It meant withdrawing from the social circuit, the fundraisers and the galas, and the rooms full of people who needed to see him in them, and discovering that the withdrawal cost him less than he'd always assumed it would, because most of what those rooms had given him was the sensation of being seen rather than anything of actual substance. It meant, on a Tuesday in late January, calling a contractor who specialized in historical restoration and asking whether the work of repairing a severely damaged antique pocket watch, Swiss movement, 1923, hairspring bent out of true, case cracked along the spine, was possible, and being told yes, it was possible, and that the work would take 6 weeks, and that the cost was significant, and saying, that's fine, start immediately. It meant, in February, establishing a foundation under the Moretti family's legitimate corporate structure, focused on employment and skills development in 3 Brooklyn neighborhoods where the family had operated for generations. Not for visibility, without a press release, without his name on the building. It meant writing the first check himself and handing it to a woman who ran a workforce training program out of a church basement and watching her face when she looked at the amount and feeling something from that he hadn't felt in years and not being able to name it for several hours and then naming it useful. He had felt useful. It meant, slowly and incompletely, becoming a version of himself that he did not yet entirely recognize, but that felt, in ways he couldn't fully articulate, more structurally sound than the previous version. The watch came back from the restorer in late February. He held it in his hands for a long time before he opened the case. The crack along the spine had been repaired with a technique the restorer described as invisible joining, a resin compound that reinforced the fracture from the inside while leaving no visible trace on the surface. If you didn't know where the break had been, you couldn't find it. But it was there, in the structure, permanently, as a kind of internal history that the exterior didn't advertise. He opened the case. The mechanism ran. He held it to his ear and listened to it tick and thought about Claire spending 2 evenings on the hairspring, breathing shallowly so as not to disturb it, the jeweler's loop, and the patience she hadn't known she possessed until she tried. He thought about the estate sale in Connecticut he'd never asked her about. He thought about how many ordinary Tuesday evenings had been available to him, 2 years of them, in which he could have put down his phone and asked her what she was working on and genuinely listened to the answer. He put the watch in his jacket pocket. Not in a box. In his pocket. He carried it that way for 6 weeks. In March, he received a letter. Handwritten, no return address, but he knew the handwriting from the note she'd left on the kitchen table the night he'd come to her apartment with his key. He opened it standing in his kitchen. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, "I've been thinking about what I said on the phone, about the 2 seconds. I've realized I've been spending months in those 2 seconds, and that staying there is its own kind of damage. I'm not staying there anymore." The second paragraph said, "The foundation work in Brooklyn. I know it's yours. Hawthorne's team tracks charitable disbursements in our banking portfolio neighborhoods as a standard investment monitoring function. I know it was the first check written and that your name isn't on anything. I just wanted you to know that I know." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer beside where the watch used to be, and stood in his kitchen for a long time, and the city went about its business outside the window, and he let it. He wrote back 2 weeks later. 1 paragraph. "I had the watch repaired. The restorer said the internal fracture is permanent but invisible. I've been thinking about that as a kind of description, not of the watch specifically. I don't know if you'll ever want it back. I'm keeping it either way, because it's the most honest thing I own." She did not respond to the letter. He had not expected her to. The letters were not a correspondence in the functional sense. They were something more like 2 people leaving evidence that they were still in motion, still changing, still arriving somewhere, even if the destination remained unclear and the timeline was entirely her own to set. April came. Then May. The Whitmore Foundation opened its National Education Initiative at an event in a Manhattan museum, a converted industrial building on the west side that had high ceilings and raw brick walls, and the kind of space that made the people inside it feel that they were part of something that had the appropriate scale for what it was trying to do. The event was covered by 4 major outlets and 2 networks, and the footage showed Claire Whitmore, chairwoman of the Whitmore Foundation, sole heir to an estate that had restructured itself under her direction into something more transparent and more direct than it had been under her grandfather's careful opacity. Speaking at a podium without notes, looking at an audience of educators and students and philanthropists, and saying things that were specific enough to indicate she understood exactly what she was building and why. Damien watched the coverage from his office. He watched the way she stood at the podium. The same posture she'd had in the Carlisle Grand Ballroom in December, moving through a room that didn't part for her. The same spine, the same quality of occupying exactly the space she occupied without apology or performance. Only the context had changed. The room now knew exactly who she was. He watched her answer a question from a journalist after the formal remarks. Something about whether the foundation's scale created a risk of losing the personal focus that defined its early work. And he watched her think for a moment. Actually think, not perform thinking, before she answered, and the answer was characteristically direct and specific and did not waste words. He turned off the coverage. He took the watch from his jacket pocket. He thought about calling. He had her new number. She had given it to him in a text after the second letter. Only the number, no message, which he had understood as exactly what it was. A door, left open, operable whenever he chose, but not an invitation to step through immediately. He did not call. Not that day. Not for 2 more weeks. When he did, she answered on the second ring. "I watched the event," he said. "The education initiative." "I know," she said. "Hawthorne mentioned you'd reached out for the broadcast link." He hadn't known Hawthorne would tell her that. "It was—" He stopped, started again. "You were extraordinary." Silence on the line. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has something in it. The Brooklyn program, she said. 340 placements in 4 months. That's their number, he said. I just wrote the check. That's not a small thing, she said. Writing the check is not a small thing. It felt small, he said. Compared. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. He reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers found the watch case. He held it without taking it out. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. Not a request, not an appeal. He breathed. I want to ask you one honest question, and I want you to give me an honest answer, and whatever the answer is, I'll accept it without argument. She waited. If I had been a different man that night, he said, if those 2 seconds had gone differently, if I had turned to Victoria and said, nothing, if I'd just held the watch and looked at you and said thank you, if I'd chosen you instead of the room. He stopped. Would any of what came after have happened? The question sat on the line between them. He heard her breathe. No, she said quietly. None of it. That's what I thought, he said. Damien, I'm not asking so that you'll feel sorry for me, he said. I'm asking because I needed to know where it started, the exact place. I needed to be able to stand at the exact place where it started and see it clearly. He paused. I can see it clearly now. She was quiet for a long moment. I know you can, she said. That's the thing that's been different about these months. I can hear it. She paused. The letters, the work, the way you answered the phone just now. Another pause. You're different. I'm trying to be. I know. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it that had not been there in the phone call in December, or in the attorney's conference room with its empty chair, or in the parking garage outside Victoria's building. Something that was not warmth exactly, or was warmth, but a specific kind, the kind that comes from something having cooled enough to be touched without burning. I'm not the same either, she said. What are you? He said. She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear her thinking about the question, taking it seriously, not deflecting. I'm someone who knows what she's worth, she said. Not because of the estate, because of what I did with the 6 months after. She paused. I always knew what I was worth. I just forgot to act like it. He closed his eyes briefly. I know, he said. They stayed on the line together for a few seconds without speaking. The charity exhibition, she said. The Whitmore Foundation is co-sponsoring an art exhibition at the end of the month. New York artists, a lot of them young, a lot of them from the same neighborhoods your foundation is working in. She paused. I'll be there. He understood that she was not inviting him. She was telling him something true, and what he did with it was his choice. I'll be there too, he said. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They hung up. He sat in his office for a long time. Then he took the watch from his pocket and set it on the desk in front of him and looked at it. The case caught the afternoon light the way objects catch light when they have been cared for. Not perfectly, not without evidence of what they'd been through, but honestly, the surface showing its history without concealing it. He looked at it for a while. Then he put it back in his pocket and got up and went back to work. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening at the end of March. The venue was a gallery in Chelsea. Long white rooms, high ceilings, the work on the walls, the kind of work that demanded something from the people looking at it, rather than offering them easy comfort. The crowd was mixed in the specific way that Whitmore Foundation events were mixed. Money and youth and working artists and educators and city officials, the whole range. Nobody arranged by category. Damien arrived at 7. He came alone. No Sal. No car waiting outside with the engine running. No one to read the room for threats. Just himself in a dark jacket moving through a gallery full of people looking at paintings. He saw her at 7:20, across the room. She was standing in front of a large canvas, abstract dark blues and grays with one diagonal line of a color that was almost orange, a very specific and deliberate almost. She was looking at it with her arms loosely at her sides and her head tilted very slightly, which he recognized as the way she looked at paintings that were doing something she wanted to understand. She was wearing dark green. Her hair was down. The silver bracelet was on her wrist, the one from her grandmother. She had not upgraded it. He crossed the room. She heard him coming, not because he made noise, but because she had always had an awareness of him that was partly involuntary, that she'd noticed in herself early in their time together and never entirely explained. She turned when he was perhaps 8 feet away. They looked at each other. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him when the public version of himself was absent, directly, without the performance of social ease, just one person reading another person's face with the attention of someone who has learned to read it and has not forgotten how. He looked at her the way he should have looked at her in a ballroom in December, in front of 500 people, when she held out a watch wrapped in brown paper with kitchen twine. Like she was the most significant thing in the room, not the most powerful, not the most strategically important, the most significant. The distinction was everything. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she turned slightly to indicate the painting behind her. "What do you see?" she said. It was the question she used to ask him in galleries early in their time together, before he'd stopped going. He looked at the canvas, the dark blues and grays, the single diagonal line of almost orange. "Something that broke," he said, and the break went in an unexpected direction and turned out to be the most interesting thing about it. She looked at the painting for a moment. "That's not a bad reading," she said. "I've been thinking about how things break," he said, "for a while now." She looked at him. The look was not warm in the simple sense, not cold either. It was the look of someone who is assessing something they have thought about extensively and are now seeing in front of them for the first time after all the thinking, and finding that it matches in some ways and doesn't match in others, and that both of those things are true simultaneously. "I know," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the watch and held it in his palm between them. She looked at it. The case was repaired. She could see where the fracture had been, because she knew exactly where it had been. But the repair was so clean that someone who didn't know wouldn't find it. She looked at the engraved initials on the outside, slightly worn now from months of being carried in a jacket pocket. She looked at the hinge. She took it from his palm. She opened the case. She listened. The mechanism ran. The tick was even, steady, the product of all the small components she had aligned and cleaned and reassembled over 9 evenings at her kitchen table, now running through whatever had happened to it since, the fall, the fracture, the 6 weeks with a restorer who understood how to make broken things hold. She closed the case. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back in his open palm and folded his fingers over it with both her hands and looked up at him. "Keep it," she said. "Claire, keep it," she said again, "not returned as a gift, not restored to its original owner." Something else. Something that said, "This is yours now because of what it has been through, and what you have been through with it, and what that means about who you are now." He closed his hand around it. They stood in the gallery for another moment, surrounded by art and people and the accumulated noise of a room full of effort and intention, and between them was everything that had happened, and everything it had cost, and everything it had changed, laid out like a map of a terrain they had both crossed from different directions and arrived at the same point on, altered, not healed exactly, but something more honest than healed. She took a breath. "I should get back," she said. "There are people I need to speak to." "Of course," he said. She started to turn. Claire. Just her name, the way he said it when he meant it rather than the way he said it in rooms full of people when he was managing something. She looked back at him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you gave me that I didn't understand I was receiving." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for eventually figuring it out." She turned and walked into the room, not away from him exactly, but toward everything else she was building, toward the people she needed to speak to, toward the work she had made out of the year since December, and she moved through the gallery with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was worth, and had stopped acting otherwise. And the room arranged itself around her with the naturalness of a room arranging itself around someone who has earned the space they're standing in. Damien watched her go. He stood with the watch in his closed hand and watched her move through the gallery, and he did not call after her, and he did not follow, and he did not try to reclaim what was gone or rush toward what was not yet arrived. He stood with what was true, that he had broken something that mattered, and been broken himself by the breaking of it, and had used the fracture as the restorer had used the invisible joining, reinforcing from the inside quietly, without announcement, becoming more structurally sound precisely where the damage had been deepest. He opened his hand. The watch caught the gallery's light. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket, close to his chest, where he had carried it for months and would continue to carry it, not as a punishment and not as a trophy, but as the most accurate record he owned of who he had been and who he was learning, slowly and at considerable cost, to become. He turned and walked toward the nearest painting. He stood in front of it and looked at it the way she had taught him to look, which was slowly and without needing it to resolve quickly, which was with the patience of someone who understood that the most important things don't announce themselves but have to be earned by attention, by stillness, by the willingness to stand in front of something difficult long enough that it begins, finally, to speak. Outside, the city moved in its perpetual and indifferent current, carrying everyone forward whether they were ready or not. And the gallery held its light against the dark, and inside it, two people who had cost each other something irreplaceable were both, separately and together, in the slow and unglamorous and necessary work of building something worth more than what they'd lost.